When Curtis Mayfield, the heartbeat of soul, the man who turned struggle into symphonies, left this world, the entire music community seemed to freeze. But what followed shocked everyone. At his final farewell, 10 of R&B's biggest legends were nowhere to be seen. No tributes, no final embraces, no voices raised in his honor. Why was Aretha Franklin, who once brought Curtis's own compositions to life, missing from the front row? Why did Prince, who openly admitted, if there was no Curtis, there'd be no Prince, remain silent in the shadows? And what of the 8 others whose absence felt like whole chapters ripped from the story of black music? Were these private goodbyes, quiet grief, or something far more complicated than the public ever knew? Before we uncover the truth behind these unexplained absences, make sure you like, comment, and subscribe, because what you're about to learn will shift everything you thought you knew about Curtis Mayfield's final days. Number 1. Aretha Franklin. Not every absence is intentional, but when the missing figure is Aretha Franklin, the undisputed queen of soul, and the man in the casket is Curtis Mayfield, the quiet genius who helped revive her career during one of its most fragile chapters, the silence becomes almost unbearable. No one imagined she wouldn't come. After all, you cannot speak of the Sparkle soundtrack without acknowledging the electric harmony between Aretha and Curtis, a partnership that needed no grand gestures to ignite an era. That album reshaped Aretha's entire image, pulling her away from sorrow-laden ballads and placing her in the world of fierce, layered, emotionally complex black women. Their artistic chemistry felt effortless, yet beneath that brilliance lay a hairline crack no one saw at the time. Whispers from studio veterans claim that after Sparkle's triumph, the pair planned a second collaboration, a live album recorded in an intimate Detroit theater. But that vision dissolved before a single microphone was switched on. An elderly technician later recalled a tense disagreement over royalty percentages, the kind that bruises trust more than it breaks it. No confirmation ever surfaced, but from that moment forward, Curtis and Aretha never stood on the same stage again. So years later, when news broke that Curtis had passed, people waited for Aretha's arrival. They waited and waited. Instead, witnesses saw her limousine glide past the funeral home, then turn away without stopping. The public explanation arrived days later. She had been undergoing serious medical treatment and was unable to travel long distances. Sensible enough. But for those who had observed their history closely, it felt like only half the truth. Artists who attended the service said the shock wasn't the absence itself, but the silence surrounding it. No statement, no message, not even a brief acknowledgement. Only the following afternoon did a towering bouquet of white flowers arrive, its ribbon stitched with forever respect. Aretha, accompanied by a heartfelt, nearly 2-page handwritten note. A relative of Curtis revealed a line from the letter, "Curtis gave me a sound I didn't know I needed. My heart was there, but I couldn't be." Those who read the note wept, not because the words were poetic, but because they carried the weight of unspoken regret. It felt like Aretha was apologizing not only for her absence that day, but for all the years the two icons allowed distance to settle between them. In a world where black music once stitched together wounded spirits, this silence became its own form of heartbreak. For fans who grew up with Aretha's voice as a balm and a battle cry, her absence held a quiet, aching sorrow. Not every farewell requires presence, but sometimes a single embrace can heal what time could not. Curtis never received that final embrace from the woman whose voice had moved generations, and that perhaps is a sorrow that will never fully fade. Number 2. Al Green. Not everyone finds the strength to say goodbye, especially when the one departing is woven into their musical soul. The story behind Al Green's absence from Curtis Mayfield's funeral, a man he once described as his guiding flame, remains one of the quietest yet deepest wounds in the soul music world. It was never spoken aloud, never debated publicly, yet the weight of that silence hovered like a shadow no one could escape. A tension unaddressed, but felt in every soft, lingering chord of their shared universe. Among the hundreds who gathered in Chicago that day, not a single glimpse of Al Green appeared. No flowers, no note, no official statement, only a hollow space where his presence should have been, a space that felt almost sacred in its emptiness. What made the silence ache even more was the collective understanding that Curtis and Al, though they had never stepped into a studio together, were connected by something deeper than collaboration. They shared a spiritual dialect, a frequency of liberation, faith, and Black resilience that few artists could ever translate. Rumors swirled that during the funeral, Al was living in near-total retreat from the music world, devoting himself entirely to his Memphis church, where he preached more often than he sang. Yet the story gained another dimension weeks later when, in a rare recorded sermon, he paused mid-message and simply said, "Curtis didn't die. He ascended." An elderly woman sitting in the front pew reportedly broke down in tears, as if that single sentence shattered whatever emotional barrier she had been clinging to. A former bandmate of Al's once shared in an unofficial interview, Al never went to funerals, especially for people like Curtis. He believed no one had the authority to declare an end to their lives. When that comment resurfaced on an underground soul forum, it ignited intense debate. Some labeled it emotional avoidance, a refusal to face mortality. Others, particularly longtime fans who lived through the era when both men sang healing into broken communities, believed it was Al's spiritual way of keeping Curtis immortal. The artistic world remained split. To some, Al's absence felt so private it bordered on coldness. To others, it was simply a man protecting his heart. But everyone agreed on one thing: the void was undeniable, not because the church lacked people, but because the wrong person was missing. During the BET memorial broadcast, the host repeated Al's haunting words, allowing them to hang in the air with no background music, no dramatic effect. The silence afterward said everything. It revealed a man torn between faith, love, and grief. A man perhaps unable to attend because Curtis wasn't merely a legend to him, but something sacred. Or maybe, deep down, Al Green just wasn't ready to let him go. Number 3, Luther Vandross. There are certain figures whose absence speaks louder than a eulogy. At Curtis Mayfield's funeral, that silent void belonged to Luther Vandross, not because he forgot, not because his heart was distant, but because the body he once ruled with velvet-smooth power, the body behind Never Too Much, was no longer able to carry him where his spirit longed to be. On the day Curtis was laid to rest, surrounded by generations who had grown from his melodies, Luther lay in a hospital room hundreds of miles away. He was fighting a quiet battle, one whose severity was whispered about but never fully understood. Anyone raised on the music of the 80s and 90s knew Luther wasn't just a voice. He was a feeling, a tenderness wrapped in sound. He sang love the way people actually lived it, achingly, beautifully, truthfully. And he revered Curtis not only as a musician, but as a vessel of purpose. Curtis sang for the overlooked. Luther did too, only for a different kind of forgotten soul, the lonely man staring out a high-rise window, the heartbroken woman waiting by a silent phone. Though their paths never crossed in a studio, their missions converged. Both gave voice to those who struggled to find their own. By the time Curtis's funeral approached, Luther had all but vanished from the spotlight. Reporters excused it as rest, a temporary retreat. Few dared to probe deeper. Luther loathed pity, yet a longtime industry friend later revealed he wanted to go, his heart was there, but his body wouldn't let him. That single sentence contained everything. His absence was not of spirit, only of failing strength. A nurse from the rehabilitation center where Luther was staying added another layer to the story. On the morning of the funeral, Luther made one request: silence. No visitors, no phone calls. Only his speakers and a playlist he had curated himself, every track from Roots, one of Curtis's lesser-known works. Luther once called it the most spiritual and overlooked album he ever made. According to the nurse, he played Beautiful Brother of Mine 3 times in a row. Some believed he wept. Others believed he prayed. Perhaps he did both. Luther and Curtis never shared a microphone, yet they were bound by something greater than a duet. They sang not for glory, but for healing. Their music didn't roar, it wrapped itself around wounded people and held them steady. That is why Luther's absence at the funeral wasn't just an empty chair. It was a pause, a deep inhale in the collective memory of his fans, an unfinished sentence that would never be completed. Months later, when a music magazine dedicated an issue to Curtis, they reached out to Luther for a comment. Too weak for an interview, he sent a typed, handwritten letter message containing a single line: "Some voices leave the room, but never leave your soul. Curtis was that for me." It was the last time Luther ever spoke his name. Soon after, he too began fading into the quiet, leaving behind only the music and the silences that defined him. Number 4, Prince. He didn't attend, and strangely, no one was surprised. Yet the absence still rattled people. Prince, the eternal outlier, once again chose a path entirely his own, even in mourning. No statement, no public tribute, not even a shadow caught by cameras. And still, his name was whispered almost as often as Curtis Mayfield's, the man being laid to rest. In a world of rituals, white lilies, and trembling hymns, Prince remained unbound by convention. For him, Curtis was far too monumental for a standard farewell. To a close member of the new power generation, Prince had once said a line that later circulated like a riddle, an explanation wrapped inside an apology. Prince's brilliance and his torment were often the same. He loved his heroes with ferocity, yet he didn't express affection the way most people did. Everyone knew he idolized Curtis from adolescence. You could hear Mayfield's fingerprints all over the Rainbow Children, from the fluid guitar glides to the mystical, socially charged narratives. In a rare early 90s interview, Prince once offered a confession so stark the room fell silent. If there was no Curtis, there'd be no Prince. And still, on the day Curtis was memorialized, Prince was nowhere to be found. No flowers, no letter, no emissary. The news spread quickly, partly out of expectation, partly out of confusion. But according to a longtime assistant, the truth was far quieter and far more intimate. Prince had held a private memorial inside Paisley Park, alone, no audience, no cameras. Just candles flickering against dark walls, a pristine Superfly vinyl placed at the center of the studio, and his white guitar resting against velvet fabric. It was said he played Keep On Keeping On, let the last note fade into the room, then switched off the lights and sat in complete stillness until the sun rose. Years later, a former Paisley Park sound engineer revealed another detail. The Superfly record in that memorial wasn't an ordinary pressing but a rare European edition. Prince had purchased it for a hefty sum only days after Curtis's passing. It wasn't extravagance, it was devotion, a vow spoken not in words but in preservation. "I will keep you close, in my own way." Some critics labeled Prince cold, aloof, even disrespectful for not appearing publicly. But those who truly understood him knew better. Prince did not believe in goodbyes. He carried people within his private universe, untouched by public expectation. To him, Curtis wasn't a speech, a service, or a wreath. Curtis was sound, atmosphere, the dim glow in a studio long after the world had gone quiet. Number 5, Patti LaBelle. Patti LaBelle has always been a storm wrapped in sequins. On stage, she didn't simply perform. She erupted, with her sky-high hair, her soaring belts, and her signature gesture of stretching her arms wide as if to hold the entire world. Patti embodied power, resilience, and unshakable grace. But Curtis Mayfield was not a name she could face with that same unbreakable image. The day she chose not to appear at his funeral was not a decision of avoidance. It was the moment her spirit simply could not move forward. In the days leading up to Curtis's final farewell, Patty abruptly canceled a string of shows, interviews, and public appearances. No explanation. No prepared statement. She simply withdrew, vanishing from the spotlight with a silence that unnerved even those closest to her. A longtime staff member who had spent over a decade by her side quietly shared, "She was too shattered to stand. I had never seen her like that." Few knew that Patty and Curtis had performed duets at charity events. Even fewer understood that their bond ran deeper than musical admiration. Patty often called him her soul brother, not because their voices blended beautifully, but because their lives aligned. They were two kids from hardship who clawed their way into an industry that was never designed for them, two artists fighting to keep their hearts intact in a business that rewarded masks more than truth. In an old interview, Patty once recounted the first piece of advice Curtis gave her: "Don't ever lose your church." She thought he meant religion. Only years later did she realize he was talking about her center, her roots, her authenticity, the part of her that fame could easily smother if she wasn't vigilant. So when Curtis passed, Patty did not attend the funeral. She did not stand beside his casket or hold his family in her arms. Her absence was not coldness. It was pain too raw to display in public. A member of her band revealed that the night before the service, Patty locked herself in her private studio. She didn't turn on the lights. She didn't rehearse. She simply sat before the microphone in total darkness, listening to people get ready on repeat, until her tears blurred everything around her. Weeks later, Patty returned to the public eye on a live television broadcast. No promotion, no headlines. She stepped into the spotlight with a quiet that felt heavier than any silence before it. Then she began to sing, a tender blend of Curtis's "People Get Ready" and her own "You Are My Friend," the song she reserved for moments too fragile for ordinary words. Each note trembled, stretched, and cracked, as if she were holding herself together by nothing more than breath. The audience didn't applaud. They simply watched, still as stone, knowing they were witnessing something private made accidentally public. For Patty, Curtis was more than a collaborator, more than a friend. He was living proof that one could be an artist without surrendering their humanity. And her absence that day, complicated, grieving, full of unspoken love, was her way of keeping him close, away from the cameras, away from strangers. No one saw her break, but when the stage lights dimmed and her final note dissolved into silence, everyone understood. Patti LaBelle had said goodbye, in the only way her heart could bear. Number 6, Diana Ross. It began, strangely enough, with silence. No scandal, no dramatic refusal, just an absence that felt too loud to ignore. When Diana Ross's name failed to appear on the guest list for Curtis Mayfield's funeral, the murmurs started instantly. Not because people expected a grand entrance, but because they believed she would surely come. They had shared stages. They had breathed the tense, electric air of Motown in the 70s. They had risen through an industry that only flickered its lights on for brief moments after a lifetime of clawing their way forward. Curtis wrote the soundtrack of a generation. Diana embodied it. They were not intimate friends, but bound by something deeper. The silent camaraderie between two black artists who climbed from the same trenches, where glamour was earned twice over, and dignity was often all one had left. And yet, on that day, people waited and waited, but she never appeared. No iconic silhouette, no echoing footsteps, no poised gaze that always seemed to know its place in the world. Diana Ross was absent, and when the official guest list leaked, her name was unquestionably missing. Rumors bloomed immediately. Someone close to the Mayfield family claimed she ignored the invitation. Diana's camp countered without hesitation. She never received it. A longtime team member revealed softly. Diana was hurt. She thought she wasn't wanted there. It sounded unbelievable, but those who knew the business understood how easily a single miscommunication could fracture decades of unspoken respect. Whispers later revealed that Diana phoned Curtis's wife the evening after the funeral. The call lasted under 4 minutes. During it, Diana wept, not the glamorized, camera-ready tears the public sometimes imagined, but the quiet grief of someone who realized she had missed a moment that would never return. Days later, at a small memorial in Chicago, a video was played. No lashes, no sequins, no spotlights, just Diana Ross in a dim studio, speaking one line. "Curtis, your voice made room for mine. Thank you." Then she bowed her head. The room froze as though holding its breath. Soon, a different question circulated among artists and fans were misunderstandings within the Black artistic community, a community long pushed aside and forced to fight for its own worth, often born not from conflict, but from the invisible distances created by history, by survival, by decades of feeling unwelcome even in the spaces they helped build. Diana Ross's absence was not intentional, not cold, but it was a stark reminder that sometimes the deepest wounds come not from enemies, but from messages never delivered, from a single letter that never reached the hands it was meant for. And for those whose lives have always been scored by music, that silence played like the saddest song of all. Number 7. Smokey Robinson. There comes a point in life when sorrow no longer arrives as a shock, but as a weary echo, a stage where each farewell grows heavier than the last, where the sound of a graveside horn feels unbearable, where even the simple act of buttoning a black suit induces dread. For Smokey Robinson, a Motown pillar who had watched generations of musical giants rise, blaze, and fade, the death of Curtis Mayfield was a familiar wound, yet no less devastating. And he stayed away from the funeral, not out of neglect, but because he had stood at far too many caskets to bear one more. Through the 1990s, Smokey said goodbye again and again to the men who had helped shape his world. Marvin Gaye, David Ruffin, Eddie Kendricks, Melvin Franklin, names that once filled studios and backstage hallways with laughter and harmonies, now existed only in memory. Though Curtis wasn't a Motown artist, he belonged to the same battle-worn generation, artists who had to lift their voices during an era when their very skin could deny them a stage. A former assistant to Smokey Sepp's longtime manager recalled the moment news of Curtis Sepp's passing reached him. Smokey didn't Sepp cry. He didn't Sepp speak much. He simply grew quiet and repeated one line he would later write in a letter to the Mayfield family. "Curtis was the truth. I celebrate him every day." That simple sentence soon echoed through memorial tributes across the country, a reminder that paying honor isn't always about standing before mourners, but about holding someone close in the silent rituals of daily life. Smokey didn't attend the funeral. Some understood immediately, others called it distant or even cold. But beneath it was the exhaustion of a man who had carried too many losses, who loved deeply but no longer had the strength to stand among grieving crowds. One industry friend later shared what Smokey was doing that very day. At home, alone, he pulled out his old vinyl collection, placed Move On up on the turntable, and let it play loudly through the house. No visitors, no stage sorrow. Only music drifting between the walls and the faint aroma of a lit candle. It was his private ceremony, stripped of spectacle, crafted from memory. To Smokey Robinson, Curtis Mayfield was more than a voice. He was a compass of integrity in a tumultuous era, the truth, as Smokey wrote. And when that truth left the world, Smokey chose to honor him not in a crowded chapel, but in the quiet grooves of a spinning record, letting Curtis live on not through public grief, but through the music that had always been their shared language. Number 8. Anita Baker. Not every fracture resounds. Some split quietly, settling into years of unspoken distance. So when Curtis Mayfield passed away and Anita Baker, the velvet-voiced siren whose tone glided like clouds over calm water, chose not to attend his funeral, the public murmured the same question: what happened between them? Back in the 1980s, a tantalizing rumor circulated through the soul and R&B world. Curtis and Anita were preparing an extraordinary duet, one said to be powerful enough to shift the sound of contemporary music. And then, nothing. No record, no announcement, no fallout. Just an unexplained silence between two artists who should have created magic together. A producer who once worked closely with both revealed in a rare interview that Anita and Curtis never fought, never raised their voices. But the tension, he said, lived in the air between them. Some insisted Anita's meticulous precision, her insistence on perfection down to the last breath, made collaboration difficult. Others whispered that Curtis found the environment too polished, too structured, lacking the raw emotional grit he cherished. Whatever the truth, the project vanished, and so did any public acknowledgement of their connection. Only the occasional polite reference remained. Their names often mentioned in the same lineage of influence, yet separated by an invisible wall. So when Curtis died, many assumed this would be Anita's moment to close the distance. But she didn't attend. No flowers were sent, no letter was read aloud, only a brief interview afterward, in which a journalist asked directly, "Why didn't you attend?" Anita paused before answering softly, "Some goodbyes aren't meant to be seen." The room fell silent. Was it regret? Was it pride? Or was it Anita Baker's way of guarding something fragile, a memory, a wound, a connection too complex to expose under the harsh lights of grief and ceremony? Perhaps Curtis lived for her exactly where she needed him to within the music, untouched by ritual. Months later, during a Detroit concert, Anita altered her set list without warning. As the audience leaned in, she played the unmistakable opening riff of The Makings of You, then slipped into No One in the World. No explanation, no dedication, yet the message was unmistakable. An elderly man in the front row whispered to his wife, "That's her apology. Some pain doesn't need words." For Anita Baker, her farewell to Curtis Mayfield wasn't spoken, written, or staged. It existed instead in the quiet spaces she kept for herself. A silence tender, conflicted, and unforgettable. Number 9, Chaka Khan. She should have been there, at least. That was the sentiment many voiced. Anyone who knew music history understood that, between Chaka Khan and Curtis Mayfield, there existed more than admiration. Their connection was spiritual, a deep exchange of artistic reverence. So when the day of Curtis's funeral arrived, and Chaka's fierce gaze and explosive stage energy were nowhere to be found, a quiet storm of controversy began to stir among soul and R&B loyalists. It happened during a turbulent week. Curtis Mayfield passed away while Chaka was in the midst of her European tour for Come to My House, her bold collaboration with Prince that marked a new chapter in her career. She was in Paris when the news reached her. According to a crew member, Chaka immediately asked to fly home. But then came the logistical nightmare: visa delays, inflexible flight routes, binding contracts with French promoters. Nothing aligned. The only thing that moved forward without mercy was time, and the funeral unfolded in Chicago while she remained an ocean away. Several music outlets questioned her choices. Some fans, grieving fiercely, criticized her sharply. She should have been there. Curtis gave her her soul. But those who understood her world saw something else, a quiet devastation Chaka never articulated, only expressed through what she chose to do next. On the very night of Curtis's funeral, Chaka stepped onto a small Paris stage. The lights dimmed to a muted purple haze, her band stunned as she tossed aside her planned set list. Sitting on a stool, she leaned into the microphone and whispered, "This is for a man who shaped the sound of my soul." Then, instead of one of her signature anthems, she began to sing Keep On Keeping On, a Curtis Mayfield song rarely covered, but pulsing with resilience. She didn't cry. She didn't falter, yet her eyes held a storm that the audience felt instantly. A few days later, Chaka published a long, tender reflection on her official website. There was no defensiveness, no excuses, only gratitude. She wrote about being 15 years old when she first heard Curtis perform live. That night, his voice made me believe I could do something monumental. She ended the reflection with a line that lingered in the hearts of readers: "He made me brave." Many people misunderstand delayed grief. To some, absence feels like betrayal, but for artists, the invisible machinery of their careers often robs them of perfect timing, of the ability to surrender to heartbreak when it calls. Chaka Khan couldn't return home in time. Yet she didn't retreat from her sorrow. She honored Curtis in the only way she could, by singing him into the Paris night, carrying his spirit in every breath, every note, every trembling pause. And sometimes, that kind of farewell is more intimate, more truthful than any embrace before a casket. Number 10, Erykah Badu. Not every goodbye requires black clothing and a pew beneath a stained glass window. Erykah Badu, a woman who has always carved her own orbit, in music, in thought, in life, did not attend Curtis Mayfield's funeral, and yet her absence did nothing to diminish the love she carried for him. For Badu, farewells rarely happen in the traditional sense. So when Curtis, one of the foundational architects of the sound that later evolved into neo-soul, passed away, many assumed she would be among the mourners in Chicago. His soaring falsetto, philosophical lyricism, and spiritual introspection were woven deeply into her artistry. Thus, when the list of attendees was published and Erykah's name was nowhere to be found, the soul community erupted with speculation. But as always, Badu refused to let others narrate her intentions. Speaking softly on a Texas radio station, she said, "Curtis wouldn't set want us crying in church. He set want a jam session." Her voice carried both humor and truth, capturing the very essence of freedom that defined both her and Curtis's musical journeys. For her, the truest tribute was not silence, but rhythm, not ritual, but sound. So instead of boarding a plane to Chicago, Badu created her own memorial in Dallas, her birthplace. No headlines, no crowds, just a circle of trusted musicians, a few candles flickering in her private studio, and an entire night dedicated to Curtis's music, reimagined through the dreamy pulse of neo-soul. Move On Up became a slow, honeyed meditation. Superfly shifted into a haunting swirl of synth pads and gentle drum loops. Each song felt less like a performance and more like communion. A friend who attended the gathering later recalled, "It felt like we were sitting inside her heartbeat and Curtis was somewhere in the room." To Badu, Curtis was not a funeral program or a moment frozen in grief. He was a living echo inside her soundscape, an influence breathed into every harmony she shaped. And that is precisely why her absence at the church was not a neglectful silence, but a deliberate, deeply authentic gesture. Some still murmured that she should have been there, but those who truly understand Erykah, those who have let her music seep into their bones for decades, know she rarely speaks through formalities. She speaks through melody, through vibration, through the kind of quiet, soul-stirring homage only music can deliver. And in Curtis Mayfield's case, her farewell whispered through bass lines, candlelight, and reimagined riffs may have been the most beautiful tribute he ever received. And as we close this chapter, one truth becomes clear. Love doesn't always show itself in front-row seats or public farewells. Sometimes it exists in silence, in the memories artists hold close, in the grief too personal to display, and in the ways they continue carrying someone long after the music stops. Curtis Mayfield touched countless hearts, and even those who weren't present at his funeral honored him in their own private, profound way. Now we want to hear from you. Which part of Curtis Mayfield's story moved you the most? And what does saying goodbye mean to you when it comes to the artists who shaped your life? Share your thoughts in the comments. We read every one. If this story resonated with you, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to our channel, and turn on notifications so you won't miss more powerful, heartfelt explorations into the world of music and the legends who shaped it. Thank you for watching to the very end. Check out the videos on your screen for more stories, more truth, and more soul. We still see you in the next one.